In 2012, a team of archaeologists pointed a laser at the Cambodian jungle and discovered something impossible. Hidden beneath the dense canopy, invisible from the ground, was a city. But not just any city. The largest pre-industrial urban complex ever found. A sprawling metropolis covering nearly 400 square miles, laced with canals, reservoirs, and roads. A hydraulic megacity that had been lost for 6 centuries. The city was Angkor, and you probably know it from the famous temple, Angkor Wat. But here's what most people don't know. Angkor Wat was just the ceremonial center of something much bigger. Something that required an engineering feat so sophisticated that modern scientists are still trying to understand how it worked. We're talking about a civilization that moved more earth than the pyramids of Giza, that created artificial lakes larger than many natural ones, that figured out how to harvest rice 3 times a year in a climate where most places struggle to grow it once. And they did all of this in the 12th century. The Khmer Empire didn't just build temples. They built an empire on water. They engineered rivers. They commanded monsoons. They turned one of the most challenging environments on Earth into one of the most productive. In this video, you're going to discover how they did it. We'll explore the massive reservoirs called berets that could hold enough water to fill 15,000 Olympic swimming pools. We'll understand the canal networks that made Angkor the Venice of Southeast Asia. We'll see how water wasn't just practical for the Khmer, it was sacred, political, and the very foundation of their power. And we'll uncover why, despite all their engineering genius, the system eventually failed. Leading to one of history's great mysteries, why did nearly 1 million people abandon the world's largest city? To understand the Water Kings of Angkor, we need to start with a problem that has faced civilizations throughout history. How do you feed a ayao city? The challenge the Khmer faced was unique. They lived in the Mekong Delta region of mainland Southeast Asia, in what is now Cambodia. This is tropical monsoon territory, which means the climate operates on extremes. For half the year, from May to October, you get torrential rains. The monsoon season dumps so much water that rivers flood, rice paddies turn into lakes, and travel becomes nearly impossible. Then, from November to April, the rain stops, almost completely. The ground bakes, rivers shrink, and if you haven't stored water somewhere, your crops die. So the problem isn't really drought or flood, it's both. Too much water at once, then none at all. And if you want to build a city, a real city that can feed tens of thousands of people, you need to solve this problem. You need to capture the monsoon water and release it slowly during the dry season. Now, this is a challenge civilizations around the world have faced. The Romans built aqueducts. The Mesopotamians dug canals. The Chinese constructed levees. But the Khmer took it to another level entirely. Let's put this in perspective. At its peak in the 12th century, Angkor had a population estimated between 750,000 and 1 million people. That made it larger than any European city of the same period. London had maybe 50,000 people. Paris had 100,000. Angkor dwarfed them both. And unlike London or Paris, which could import food from surrounding farms, Angkor was in the middle of a jungle, in a climate that alternated between flood and drought, with soil that wasn't particularly fertile. So how did they do it? The answer is rice, specifically wet rice cultivation, and an engineering system so massive and complex that archaeologists are still mapping it today. But before we get into the how, we need to understand the who. Who were these engineers? Where did this knowledge come from? The Khmer Empire was founded in 802 CE by a king named Jayavarman II. But the Khmer people had been in the region for centuries before that, and they'd been experimenting with water management for just as long. Early Khmer states like Funan and Genla had built basic irrigation canals. Small-scale stuff, useful for local farming, but nothing that could support a major city. The real innovation started in the 9th century, when Khmer kings began thinking bigger, much bigger. They realized something crucial. If you could control water, you could control everything. Food production, trade routes, population, density, political power. And they had a model to follow. Sort of. Indian civilization had influenced Southeast Asia for centuries. This process historians call Indianization. Sanskrit language, Hindu and Buddhist religions, architectural styles. The Khmer absorbed it all. But while Indian kingdoms had built impressive temples, the Khmer were about to outdo them in engineering. So let's see what they built and how they built it. The foundation of Khmer water engineering was something called a beret. This is a Khmer word that basically means reservoir, but that's like calling the Grand Canyon a ditch. A beret was a massive human-made lake. The first major beret was built by King Indravarman Wampens in 879 CE. It was called the Indratataka beret, and it was enormous, about 3,800 meters long and 800 meters wide. That's roughly 2 miles long and half a mile wide. Imagine digging that by hand, with Bronze Age tools, in tropical heat. But here's the thing, they didn't just dig a hole and let it fill with rain. These berets were engineered with incredible precision. They were rectangular, perfectly aligned with cardinal directions, surrounded by earthen dikes that had to be maintained constantly to prevent breaching, and the location was strategic. The Khmer built berets near rivers, specifically near the Siem Reap River that flows through Angkor. During the monsoon season, when the river swelled with rainwater, they diverted water into the berets through a system of inlet canals, essentially creating artificial lakes that would store water for the dry season. But storing water was just step one. The real genius was distribution. From each beret, a network of outlet canals carried water to the surrounding rice fields. These canals were built at gentle gradients, just enough slope to keep water flowing, but not so much that it eroded the canal walls. It's the kind of precision engineering that requires serious mathematical knowledge. And the canals didn't just go to one place. They branched and branched again, creating a sprawling network that could irrigate thousands of hectares of farmland. Some canals were major arteries, 10 meters wide. Others were small distribution channels that fed individual paddies. The system was so extensive that modern archaeologists, using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, have identified over 1,000 kilometers of canals around Angkor. That's about 620 miles of human-made waterways. For comparison, Venice, the most famous canal city in the world, has about 26 miles of canals. Now you might be thinking, okay, impressive, but why go to all this trouble? Why not just build farms near rivers and use water when it's naturally available? The answer is rice. And not just any rice cultivation, but a specific technique that the Khmer perfected: controlled wet rice farming. Rice is an unusual crop. It actually grows better when partially submerged in water. This kills competing weeds and creates ideal growing conditions. But you need to control the water level precisely. Too deep, and the rice drowns. Too shallow, and it dries out. And you need to drain the fields at exactly the right time before harvest. With the beret system, Khmer farmers could do all of this. They could flood fields with exact water depths. They could maintain those levels throughout the growing season, and they could drain fields on schedule. This meant they could grow rice in the dry season, not just the traditional monsoon crop, but additional harvests. Some historians believe the Khmer achieved 3 rice harvests per year in their most productive areas. 3. Most societies were lucky to get one. This agricultural surplus was the foundation of everything else. It fed the massive urban population. It supported the artisans who carved temples. It enabled the armies that expanded the empire. In other words, the berets weren't just engineering projects, they were power projects. Control the water, control the food, control the people. If you're enjoying discovering how ancient engineers built the impossible, drop a like to help the channel. Takes just a second and really makes a difference in helping more people find these stories. Now, let's talk about how the Khmer took this system even further, because what we've covered so far was just the beginning. As the Khmer Empire grew more powerful through the 10th and 11th centuries, the berets got bigger, much bigger, and the engineering got more sophisticated. The king who really perfected the system was Suryavarman I, who ruled from 1006 to 1050 CE. He constructed the Western Beret, and it's one of the most impressive pre-modern engineering projects on Earth. This thing is massive, 5 miles long and 1 mile wide. It could hold approximately 50 million cubic meters of water. To put that in perspective, that's enough water to fill about 20,000 Olympic swimming pools, or to supply a modern city of 100,000 people for an entire year. And remember, they built this almost 1,000 years ago without machines, without modern surveying equipment, without any of the technology we take for granted. But the Western Beret wasn't just big, it was smart. The Khmer had learned from earlier berets and incorporated innovations. They built it with a slight depression in the center, a deliberate design choice that increased water capacity. They constructed the dikes at carefully calculated angles to resist water pressure. They created emergency overflow systems to handle unexpected monsoon flooding. And here's something that often gets overlooked: maintenance. These systems required constant upkeep. Dikes needed reinforcing, canals needed dredging, silt had to be removed. The Khmer had dedicated laborers, probably thousands of them, whose job was maintaining the water network. It was like having a public works department in the 11th century. We know this because of inscriptions. The Khmer carved records into stone, temple walls, and many of these inscriptions detail water management. They list the workers assigned to canals. They describe royal decrees about irrigation rights. They even specify punishment for people who damaged water infrastructure. One inscription from the 12th century describes a conflict between two temples over water rights. Apparently, upstream monks were diverting too much water from a canal, leaving downstream farms with insufficient irrigation. The king had to intervene and establish water quotas. Sound familiar? The same disputes that cause international conflicts today were happening in medieval Cambodia. But water wasn't just practical for the Khmer, it was sacred. In Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, which deeply influenced Khmer culture, water represents purification and life. The berets weren't just reservoirs, they were earthly representations of sacred pools. In Hindu mythology, the gods dwell on Mount Meru, surrounded by cosmic oceans. The Khmer replicated this on Earth. Temples were mountains, berets were oceans. This is why you see temples built on artificial hills overlooking berets. It's not just for views, it's cosmology made concrete. The king, as a god king, remember, Khmer kings claimed divine status, ruled from his temple mountain, surrounded by his sacred ocean. It was religious theater on a massive scale, and it was politically brilliant. By controlling water infrastructure that was simultaneously practical and sacred, kings controlled both, the bodies and souls of their subjects. You needed their berets to farm, and you needed their temples to reach the gods. They had a monopoly on both earthly prosperity and divine favor. The ultimate expression of this came in the 12th century with King Suryavarman II, who built Angkor Wat. Yes, that Angkor Wat, the famous temple that appears on Cambodia's flag. Angkor Wat is stunning. 3 stories of carved galleries, 5 lotus bud towers, mile-long walls covered in reliefs. But what often gets missed is its relationship to water. The temple is surrounded by a moat that's 200 meters wide. That moat is fed by the beret system, and it's not just decorative, it's part of the hydraulic network. Water from the moat feeds canals that irrigate fields. Those fields produce rice that feeds temple workers. Those workers maintain the temple and the water system. It's a closed loop. a perfectly integrated system where religion, engineering, and economics all feed into each other. This is what made Angkor so powerful. It wasn't just that they built big temples or dug big lakes. It's that they integrated everything into one comprehensive system. Water enabled food, food enabled population, population enabled armies and artisans, artisans built temples, temples legitimized kings, kings organized water projects, round and round. For about 300 years from the 10th to 13th centuries, this system worked brilliantly. Angkor became the largest city in the medieval world. Its influence spread across mainland Southeast Asia. Khmer kings commanded resources that rivaled anyone on Earth. But there was a problem. A problem the Khmer engineers, despite all their genius, couldn't fully anticipate. The system was fragile, and when it started to fail, it failed catastrophically. So, what went wrong? How did the world's largest hydraulic civilization collapse? We're getting to the most fascinating part of the story. If you're not subscribed yet, this is a good time to hit that button. There's new content exploring forgotten engineering marvels every week. Now let's see what happened when the water system started to break down. The decline of Angkor is one of history's enduring mysteries. We know that by 1431, when Thai armies from the Ayutthaya kingdom captured the city, Angkor was already weakening, and by the 1500s it was largely abandoned. Nearly 1 million people just left. For a long time, historians blamed external factors: wars with the Thai, the shift from Hinduism to Theravada Buddhism, which supposedly weakened the God-King ideology, trade route changes that made coastal ports more important than inland cities. But in the past few decades, scientists have uncovered a different story, and it has everything to do with water. Remember how the beret system required constant maintenance? Dredging canals, reinforcing dikes, clearing silt? Well, that maintenance became harder and harder as the system aged. Because the problem with controlling rivers is that rivers don't want to be controlled. They carry sediment. That sediment accumulates. Over decades and centuries, it builds up. Archaeological studies of the canal system show increasing siltation from the 13th century onward. Canals that once carried water efficiently were clogging. Berets were losing capacity as their bottoms filled with sediment. To maintain the same level of irrigation, the Khmer needed to constantly expand and deepen their canals. But there's only so much expansion you can do. Eventually, you run into physical limits. You've already built in all the suitable locations. You've already diverted all the available rivers. You've created a system that's operating at maximum capacity, and any disruption cascades through the entire network. And then came the climate disruptions. Using tree ring data, ice cores, and other climate proxies, scientists have identified severe drought periods in Southeast Asia during the 14th and 15th centuries. These weren't normal dry seasons. These were multi-year mega-droughts, the kind of climate event that can devastate even modern civilizations. For Angkor, which depended entirely on capturing monsoon water, mega-droughts were catastrophic. The berets didn't fill. The canals ran dry. Rice harvests failed. And here's the cruel irony. The very success of the hydraulic system made Angkor vulnerable. Because they'd engineered such productivity, Angkor had grown far beyond what the natural environment could support. The city had a population of nearly 1 million people in an area that without irrigation might support 50,000. They'd built a civilization that required their engineering to work perfectly all the time. When drought struck, the system couldn't buffer it. There was no surplus capacity, no backup plan. The failure cascaded. Failed harvests meant food shortages. Food shortages meant people left. Fewer people meant less labor to maintain the water system. Less maintenance meant more failures. More failures meant more people left. It's what systems theorists call a positive feedback loop, but there's nothing positive about it. It's a cycle of decline, where each problem makes the next problem worse. And there's evidence of another factor, flooding, which seems contradictory, right? How can you have both drought and flood problems? Here's how. The Khmer had deforested huge areas around Angkor to build their city and farms. Trees stabilize soil. Without trees, when monsoons did come, they caused severe erosion. Sediment washed into the canal system faster than ever. Some researchers believe there were catastrophic floods in the late 14th century that damaged major infrastructure. So you had this perfect storm, literally and figuratively. Extended droughts stressed the system. When rains finally came, they came too hard and too fast, causing floods and erosion that damaged infrastructure. The siltation problem accelerated. Maintenance became impossible to keep up with. And gradually, the system that had sustained 1 million people stopped working. We can actually see this in the archaeological record. Studies of the Western Berets show that it stopped functioning properly in the late 14th century. Its outlet canals were clogged with sediment. Water couldn't flow out even when the beret was full. The system was broken. Now, this wasn't an overnight collapse. This took decades. People didn't wake up one morning and find Angkor empty. It was gradual. First, the outer areas were abandoned as irrigation failed, then outlying neighborhoods, then districts closer to the center. By the time Thai armies showed up in 1431, they were conquering a city already in decline. But here's what's important to understand. This wasn't a failure of intelligence or capability. The Khmer were brilliant engineers. They built one of the most sophisticated hydraulic systems in pre-modern history. They sustained the world's largest city for 3 centuries. Their vulnerability was the same as ours today. They'd built a system optimized for normal conditions. And when conditions stopped being normal, when climate changed, when the environment degraded, the system couldn't adapt quickly enough. It's a story that feels surprisingly relevant. Modern cities face similar challenges. Las Vegas and Los Angeles depend on aqueducts and reservoirs that might not survive prolonged drought. Low-lying cities face flooding from sea level rise. Agricultural systems optimized for stable climate face disruption from changing rainfall patterns. The Khmer Water Kings built something remarkable, but they also learned a hard lesson about the limits of engineering. You can control water, but you can't control climate. You can build resilient systems, but nothing is resilient against everything. And systems that work brilliantly for centuries can fail in decades when conditions change. So what happened to all the people? They didn't disappear. They dispersed. Some moved to coastal areas that were less dependent on complex irrigation. Some shifted to Thai-controlled regions. The Khmer people continued. They're the ancestors of modern Cambodians. But the great hydraulic civilization, that ended. Angkor itself was never completely abandoned. Buddhist monks continued living in some temples. Local villagers farmed what they could. But the megacity, the hydraulic marvel, the Venice of Southeast Asia, it vanished back into the jungle. For 4 centuries, the forest reclaimed Angkor. Silk cotton trees grew through temple roofs. Vines strangled stone galleries. Canals became streams. Berets became seasonal swamps. By the 19th century, when French explorers rediscovered Angkor, the hydraulic system was invisible. They could see the temples. Those massive stone structures were still there, albeit overgrown, but the canals, the berets, the entire water network, hidden beneath vegetation and sediment. It wasn't until satellite archaeology in the 21st century that we finally understood the true scale of what the Khmer had built. Those LIDAR surveys I mentioned at the start, shooting lasers through jungle canopy, revealed a city far larger than anyone imagined. Miles and miles of canals, roads, embankments, the remnants of a hydraulic civilization that once commanded water itself. And that brings us full circle. The story of the Khmer Water Kings is ultimately a story about human ingenuity and human limits, about what we can build when we understand our environment, and what happens when we push those systems to their breaking point. The Khmer figured out how to turn a jungle into a garden, how to make rice grow 3 times a year, how to sustain 1 million people in one of Earth's most challenging climates. For 3 centuries, they made it work. That's longer than the United States has existed. That's an extraordinary achievement. But they also learned that every system has thresholds. That optimization for one set of conditions creates vulnerability to others. That the more complex and interconnected a system becomes, the harder it is to maintain. And that climate and environment will eventually have the last word. There's something both inspiring and humbling about Angkor. Inspiring because it shows what humans can accomplish with pre-modern technology. Humbling because it reminds us that even our greatest works are temporary. The berets are still there, you can visit them, but they're just rectangular lakes now. Not living parts of a hydraulic system, just monuments to what once was. Sometimes I wonder what Khmer engineers would think if they could see their creation through LIDAR, if they could see the full extent of what they built, mapped out in stunning detail. Would they be proud? Probably. But maybe also surprised, because they built something so complex that even they didn't fully grasp its scale. That's the thing about great engineering. It outlasts its builders. It exceeds their vision. The Romans didn't know their aqueducts would still function 2,000 years later. The Khmer didn't know their berets would reveal secrets to 21st century satellites, and maybe that's the real legacy of the Water Kings. Not just that they built big, but that they built something that still teaches us. About hydraulic engineering, about urban planning, about sustainability and resilience, about the relationship between civilization and environment. Every time archaeologists map another canal, every time climate scientists analyze another tree ring, every time engineers study the geometry of a beret, the Khmer are teaching us something new, about their world and about ours. And that was the story of the Khmer Water Kings, the engineers who built an empire on rivers and rice, who commanded monsoons and carved lakes from jungle, and whose legacy is written in water channels beneath the Cambodian forest. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking around. These deep dives take serious research, and I appreciate you taking the time to learn about these lesser-known chapters of history. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel. There's a new video every week exploring the engineering marvels and forgotten innovations of ancient civilizations. Next video, I'll be covering another hydraulic civilization that most people have never heard of, the Hohokam of Arizona, who built 1,000 miles of canals in the desert and then vanished. It's just as mysterious as Angkor and just as impressive. Leave a comment. Did you know about Angkor's water system before this? Or did you, like most people, only know about the temples? I'm curious what surprised you most. Until next time.